Welcome to Life Stories, where we share tales that touch the heart and inspire the soul. In today's story, we delve into a journey of love, redemption, and the power of second chances. A grieving man, a brave woman, and a child abandoned in the storm come together to rewrite their destinies. Through trials and triumphs, they discover the true meaning of family and resilience, proving that even in life's darkest moments, hope can shine through. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Life Stories as we begin today's heartwarming tale. Stay with us, you won't want to miss this. The rain was relentless that evening, pouring from the heavens as if nature itself sought to cleanse the world of its sins. The streets of Boston glistened under the pale glow of streetlights, each puddle reflecting fragments of the city's turmoil. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of traffic buzzed. But closer, in the shadow of a quiet suburban road, a storm of a different kind brewed, a storm of guilt, fear, and betrayal. Emily sat in her car, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The child in her arms was silent, its tiny breaths barely audible over the pounding rain. Her thoughts were chaos, a torrent that mirrored the storm outside. The birthmark on the baby's arm burned in her mind like a brand. It was Mark's, there was no denying it. The same distinctive crescent shape, a familial marker that threatened to unravel everything she had built with Daniel. Daniel. His name sent a fresh wave of anguish coursing through her. He had been nothing but devoted. A man of principles. Someone who believed in the sanctity of their marriage. And yet, here she was, clutching a child born of her betrayal. She glanced at the baby's tiny face, peaceful despite the turmoil it had unknowingly been born into. Her tears mingled with the rain streaking the windshield. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what else to do." Emily stepped out of the car, the icy rain soaking through her coat instantly. She held the baby close to her chest as she made her way to a secluded corner near the park. It was dark, shielded by tall oak trees that stood like silent witnesses to her despair. Her hands shook as she placed the baby, wrapped tightly in a soft blanket, on the ground. She hesitated, her heart screaming at her to stop, to hold her child and find another way. But fear was louder. The fear of losing Daniel, of the truth coming out, of being branded a liar and a cheat. Fear drowned out love. "I'm so sorry," she repeated, kneeling beside the child. "You deserve more than this. Someone will find you. I promise. Someone who can give you a life I can't." Her voice broke, and for a moment, she thought she wouldn't have the strength to walk away. But then she heard footsteps in the distance, and panic gripped her heart. With one last kiss on the baby's forehead, she turned and fled, her tears lost in the rain. Miles away, under the awning of an old bus station, Hannah sat huddled against the cold. She was no stranger to the streets of Boston, having called them home for the better part of a year. Life had not been kind to her, and tonight was no exception. Her body burned with fever, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. The storm had driven most people indoors, but not Hannah. She had nowhere to go, no roof to shelter her from the deluge. "Just a few more steps," she muttered to herself as she rose, her legs trembling under her weight. Each movement was a battle, every breath a struggle. As she stumbled through the rain-soaked streets, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, pitiful cry that cut through the storm like a beacon. "What is that?" she whispered, forcing her eyes to focus. She followed the sound, each step guided by the baby's desperate wails. When she finally reached the small bundle between the trees, her heart nearly stopped. "A baby," she gasped, dropping to her knees. The child was cold to the touch, its tiny body trembling. Hannah's maternal instinct, long buried under layers of hardship and loss, surged to the surface. Without hesitation, she removed her tattered coat and wrapped it around the baby, holding it close to her chest. "You're safe now," she murmured, tears streaming down her face. "I've got you." Despite her own frailty, Hannah found strength in the baby's vulnerability. She stumbled toward the nearest hospital, her vision blurred by fever and rain. The journey was agonizing, her legs threatened to give way at every step. But she refused to stop. The baby's cries grew weaker, spurring her onward. When she finally burst through the hospital doors, drenched and shaking, the receptionist's look of disdain was immediate. "This isn't a shelter," the woman said curtly. But Hannah didn't care. "Please," she begged, collapsing to her knees. "This baby needs help." The commotion caught the attention of a man in the waiting area. Daniel, a businessman with the air of someone used to having control, was at the hospital that night for reasons he couldn't explain. He had been restless, unable to stay at home. When he saw the woman crumpled on the floor, clutching a baby, something in him stirred. "Let me help," he said, stepping forward. The receptionist hesitated, but Daniel's commanding presence left little room for argument. Together, they rushed the baby to the emergency room. Doctors and nurses sprang into action, their efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm outside. As the medical team worked, Daniel turned his attention to Hannah. She was barely conscious, her fever raging. "She needs care too," he insisted, his voice firm. It was in that moment, watching the frail woman who had risked everything for a baby that wasn't hers, that Daniel felt a shift within himself. He didn't know why he was there or what had drawn him to intervene, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Later that night, as Daniel stood in the hospital corridor, the baby now stable and Hannah resting, he stared out at the storm that continued to rage. He thought of Emily, of the life they had built together, of the child they had dreamed of. And he thought of this baby, a fragile life abandoned but not lost. "What kind of world do we live in?" he whispered to himself, "where a mother leaves her child in the cold, and a stranger saves it at the cost of her own health?" He didn't know it yet, but this night, this storm, would change everything. The morning after the storm, the sun rose hesitantly over Boston, casting a pale light over the city as if wary of revealing the damage caused by the night before. In the hospital, Daniel sat in the corner of the neonatal unit, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the tiny crib holding the baby. The child's chest rose and fell in shallow but steady breaths, the hum of medical equipment offering reassurance that he was alive, though fragile. The baby's presence stirred something deep in Daniel. He hadn't yet asked about the mother or whether she would reclaim the child. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, the thought of letting this baby go felt unbearable. Perhaps it was the emptiness left by the loss of his and Emily's own child, Ethan. Perhaps it was the look on Hannah's face, a mix of desperation and determination, as she clutched the baby in the storm. Whatever it was, it had rooted him firmly by the child's side. Across the hall, Hannah was regaining her strength. Her fever had subsided somewhat, though her body still trembled from exhaustion. She lay propped up in bed, her gaze distant, replaying the events of the previous night. When a nurse came in to check her vitals, Hannah mustered enough energy to ask, "The baby, is he okay?" The nurse offered a reassuring smile. "He's stable. That man, Daniel, he's been watching over him all night." Hannah nodded, relief flooding her. She had done the right thing, even if it had nearly cost her life. But as the nurse left, her thoughts darkened. Who had left the baby out there in the storm? What kind of parent could abandon their own child? The thought made her chest tighten, anger simmering just below the surface. Daniel decided to check on Hannah later that morning. He knocked softly before entering, his expression kind but cautious. "I wanted to thank you," he said, pulling up a chair beside her bed, "for what you did last night. That baby, you saved his life." Hannah shook her head. "I couldn't leave him there. He was so small, so helpless. Anyone would have done the same." Daniel wasn't so sure. He had seen too much indifference in the world to believe that. Not everyone would risk their own life for a child they didn't even know. There was a moment of silence. the weight of the conversation pressing down on them both. Finally, Hannah asked, "What will happen to him now?" Daniel hesitated. "That depends. If the mother doesn't come forward, he'll likely be placed in foster care." Hannah's lips tightened. "He doesn't deserve that," she said quietly. "He's already been through enough." The conviction in her voice struck Daniel. "No, he doesn't," he agreed. "But maybe there's another way." Before he could elaborate, a nurse appeared in the doorway, informing Daniel that he had a visitor. He excused himself, leaving Hannah to her thoughts. In the waiting area, Emily stood with an air of nervous anticipation. Her coat was buttoned up tightly despite the warmth of the hospital, and her eyes darted around the room. When Daniel appeared, her face softened, but only slightly. "Daniel," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I've been trying to call you." "I've been busy," he replied curtly. "What's going on?" Emily hesitated, her fingers twisting the strap of her handbag. I heard about what happened. The storm. The baby. Someone mentioned you were here." Daniel's expression hardened. "And you're here because—" Her eyes flickered, a crack forming in her carefully composed facade. "I wanted to see if you were okay." He studied her for a moment, his instincts telling him there was more to her visit. "I'm fine. The baby is fine. Thanks to someone else's bravery." His tone was sharper than he intended. But he didn't care. "If that's all." "No," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "It's not. Daniel. I need to tell you something." He crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "Then say it." Emily faltered, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "Finally," she said. "That baby. I think he might be mine." The room seemed to tilt for a moment, her words striking him like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. I made a mistake," she stammered. "A terrible mistake. Please. Let me explain." Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Explain what?" "Emily. That you abandoned a child in the middle of a storm?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I was scared. Daniel. I didn't know what to do." He isn't yours." The admission left him breathless. "Not mine," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then whose?" Her silence was answer enough. "Mark," he said, the name falling from his lips like a curse. The pieces fell into place, the tension between his wife and his brother, the moments he had dismissed as nothing more than paranoia. "It's Mark's, isn't it?" Emily nodded, her sobs racking her body. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she pleaded. "I was going to fix it. To make it right." "Fix it?" Daniel's voice rose, sharp with fury. "You think abandoning a baby in the cold is fixing it? Do you have any idea what could have happened to him?" "I know," she cried. "I know. And I hate myself for it. But Daniel, I need him back. Please. Let me make it right." He stared at her, disgusted and heartbroken. "You don't deserve him," he said, his voice cold and final. "You don't deserve either of us." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily alone in the sterile brightness of the waiting room. Back in the neonatal unit, he stood over the baby's crib, his anger giving way to resolve. This child, this innocent life, deserved better. And Daniel was determined to ensure he got it. The air in the hospital felt heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken words and irreparable actions. Daniel sat by the baby's crib, his thoughts a tangled web of anger, betrayal, and an unrelenting sense of duty. The child, tiny and fragile, stirred occasionally, his small hands curling into fists before relaxing again. Each movement seemed to anchor Daniel, drawing him closer to a decision he knew would change the course of his life. A nurse entered quietly to check the baby's vitals. She offered Daniel a kind smile, her presence a brief reprieve from the storm brewing inside him. "He's a fighter," she said softly, Adjusting the monitors. He's lucky to have someone looking out for him. Daniel nodded. Though the nurse's words felt like a double-edged sword. The baby was lucky to be alive. Yes. But the reality of how he'd come into Daniel's care was anything but fortunate. Once the nurse left, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared at the baby. "You deserve so much more than this," he whispered. "More than the chaos you were born into. More than the lies that almost cost you your life." His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. When he turned, he saw Hannah standing in the doorway, still pale but steadier on her feet than the night before. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to enter. "It's okay," Daniel said, gesturing for her to come in. "You don't have to stand there." Hannah walked slowly, her gaze fixed on the baby. She stopped beside the crib, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "He's beautiful," she said after a moment, her voice tinged with awe and sadness. "And so small. It's hard to believe he made it through that storm." Daniel looked at her, noting the exhaustion etched into her features. "He wouldn't have without you." Hannah shook her head. "I just found him. You're the one making sure he has a chance." They stood in silence for a while, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors filling the room. Finally, Hannah spoke again, her voice hesitant. "I overheard some of the nurses talking about his mother." Daniel stiffened. "What did they say?" "That she came here. That she's someone you know." The weight of the revelation hung between them, unspoken but understood. Daniel let out a long breath, leaning back in his chair. "It's true," he admitted. "Emily, my wife, she's his mother. She abandoned him during the storm because she was scared. And because he's not mine." Hannah's eyes widened in shock. She left him? Her own baby? She was afraid of what it would mean if I found out the truth. Daniel said bitterly, "That the baby isn't mine, but my brother's." Hannah's hands tightened into fists at her sides, her voice trembling with anger. "That doesn't excuse it. That baby could have died out there. He deserved better." Daniel looked up at her, surprised by the fire in her tone. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I can't give him back to her. She's already proven she doesn't deserve him." Hannah nodded, her expression softening. "What will you do?" "I'm going to adopt him," Daniel said, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. "I'll give him a home, a family. I'll make sure he knows he's loved." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, though she quickly wiped them away. That's incredible. He's lucky to have you." "No," Daniel said, shaking his head. "I'm the lucky one. After everything I've lost, he's given me something to fight for again." As they spoke, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Both Daniel and Hannah turned to see Mark standing there, his expression grim. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I don't think we have anything to say to each other." "Please," Mark insisted, stepping into the room. "Just hear me out." Reluctantly, Daniel nodded, gesturing toward the hallway. "Not here. I don't want him to hear any of this." The two men moved to an empty waiting area, leaving Hannah with the baby. Daniel crossed his arms, his posture tense as he faced his brother. "Say what you need to say and then leave." Mark hesitated, guilt written all over his face. "I never wanted things to happen this way. I didn't mean for." "You didn't mean for what?" Daniel snapped. "To betray me. To destroy my family." Mark flinched but pressed on. "I'm not here to make excuses. I want to be part of his life." Daniel's laughter was cold and sharp. "Part of his life? You and Emily nearly cost him that life. And now you want to play father? Don't make me laugh." "I made a mistake," Mark said, his voice desperate. "But I'm still his father." "You're nothing to him," Daniel said, his voice cold. "And you never will be." Mark took a step forward, his expression hardening. "You can't just cut me out. He's my son. Daniel. You can't keep him from me." Daniel's eyes burned with fury as he stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "Watch me." For a moment, the two brothers stood inches apart, the tension between them palpable. Then Mark shook his head, stepping back. "This isn't over," he said quietly before turning and walking away. When Daniel returned to the baby's room, Hannah looked up at him with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. He nodded, though his expression was stormy. "I will be," he said, his gaze softening as he looked at the baby. "As long as he's safe. I will be." Hannah didn't press further. She simply sat beside him, their shared determination to protect the child forming an unspoken bond between them. Together, they watched over the baby, their resolve solidifying as the hours passed. They wouldn't let him down, not now. Not ever. The days following the confrontation with Mark passed in a haze of activity and quiet determination. The hospital allowed the baby to remain under their care while Daniel worked with social services to secure temporary custody. The process was grueling, filled with questions, forms, and the kind of bureaucratic red tape that seemed designed to test a person's resolve. But Daniel never wavered. Every time he looked at the baby, whom he'd started calling Adam, it reinforced his determination to give the child the life he deserved. Hannah, too, remained steadfast by Adam's side. Though she had no official connection to him, her presence was invaluable. She brought a maternal warmth to the room, humming softly to Adam when he stirred or gently holding his tiny hand through the bars of the crib. It was clear to Daniel that Adam had already formed a bond with her, and he found himself grateful for her presence in a way he hadn't expected. One afternoon, as Daniel filled out yet another stack of paperwork in the hospital cafeteria, Hannah joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one in front of him and took a seat across the table. "Long day?" she asked, her tone light but empathetic. "Feels like every day is a long day lately," Daniel replied, offering her a small smile of thanks. "But it'll be worth it. Once all this is over, Adam will have a home." Hannah nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "You're doing something incredible for him. You know, most people wouldn't go to these lengths." Daniel's smile faltered slightly. "It's not just about Adam. It's about making things right. For him. For myself, even for Emily. In a way." Hannah's brow furrowed. "Emily? After what she did? You're still thinking about her?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not in the way you think. I don't forgive her. And I don't want her in Adam's life. But she's part of his story. Ignoring that won't help him. Not in the long run." Hannah studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You're a better person than most, Daniel." He shook his head. "I'm just trying to do what's right." Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse approaching their table, her expression serious. "Mr. Graham, I need you to come with me." Daniel's stomach tightened as he stood, his mind racing with possibilities. "Is Adam okay?" he asked. The nurse hesitated. "The baby is stable. But someone's here to see him." When Daniel and Hannah arrived back at the neonatal unit, they found Emily standing just outside Adam's room, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes darted to Daniel as soon as he entered, and she wrung her hands nervously. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked, his voice low and controlled. "I came to see him," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I know I don't have the right to ask, but, please, I just want to see him." Daniel clenched his jaw, his instinct to refuse warring with the part of him that still clung to the memory of the woman he had once loved. After a moment's pause, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter the room. "5 minutes," he said coldly. "That's all." Emily nodded, tears welling in her eyes as she entered the room. Hannah hesitated, looking at Daniel for guidance. He nodded for her to stay outside with him, and they watched through the glass as Emily approached the crib. Inside, Emily stood frozen for a moment, staring down at the baby who had almost been lost to her selfishness and fear. When she finally reached out, Her hand trembled as she brushed a finger gently across his tiny cheek. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's me. I'm so sorry." Daniel and Hannah exchanged a glance, both unsure of what to make of the scene unfolding before them. Emily's remorse seemed genuine, but the damage she had done was undeniable. After a few minutes, Emily stepped back from the crib, wiping tears from her cheeks. She turned and walked out of the room, stopping just short of Daniel and Hannah. "I know I don't deserve him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But please, Daniel, let me help. Let me be a part of his life." Daniel's expression was unreadable as he crossed his arms. "Why now, Emily? Why should I believe you've changed?" Emily hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Because I have. Because losing him, almost losing him, showed me what kind of person I'd become. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to make it right." Hannah stepped forward then, her voice calm but firm. "Making it right doesn't mean you get to waltz back into his life like nothing happened. It means you have to prove you're worthy of him." Emily looked at her, surprised by the strength in her tone. "And how do I do that?" "Time," Hannah said simply. "And patience. And a whole lot of humility." Emily nodded slowly, understanding the weight of the challenge before her. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady for the first time. "Just, don't shut me out completely." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He looked at Emily, then at Hannah, and finally back at the crib where Adam lay sleeping. His heart ached with the complexity of the situation. But one thing was clear: Adam's well-being would always come first. "I'll think about it," he said at last, his tone firm but not unkind. "But for now, you need to leave." Emily's shoulders sagged, but she nodded, knowing she couldn't push her luck. As she walked away, Daniel turned back to Hannah, his expression weary but resolute. "I don't trust her," he admitted. "But if there's a chance she can change, for Adam's sake, I have to consider it." Hannah placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You'll do what's right," she said with quiet confidence. "You always do." The days turned into weeks, and Daniel's focus remained on building a stable life for Adam. The hospital eventually discharged the baby into Daniel's custody, but only after ensuring he had the necessary equipment and support to care for a child with such a delicate start in life. Daniel's home, once an echoing expanse of emptiness, began to fill with the warmth of new life. Hannah, true to her promise, stayed by their side. She moved into the guest room, her presence as much for Adam as it was for Daniel, who found himself increasingly reliant on her steadying influence. Despite the chaos, their partnership began to take on a rhythm: feeding schedules, doctor visits, and the small but vital moments of joy that came with watching Adam grow stronger. One evening, after putting Adam to bed, Daniel found Hannah in the kitchen, tidying up. The warm glow of the pendant lights highlighted the streaks of exhaustion on her face. But there was also a quiet determination that he'd come to admire. "You don't have to do all of this, you know," Daniel said, leaning against the doorframe. Hannah looked up, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I know. But I want to. Besides, it's not like you can do everything on your own." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're right about that. I don't think I've slept a full night since Adam came home." Hannah set down the dish she was washing and dried her hands, turning to face him. "You're doing a good job, Daniel. Better than good. Adam's lucky to have you." Daniel's expression softened. "I don't feel like I'm doing enough. Not for him. Not for everything." Hannah stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You're doing everything you can. And that's more than enough. You gave him a second chance, Daniel. That means everything." For a moment, they stood in silence, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger. Then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, Adam's cry broke through the stillness. Both of them laughed, the tension dissipating as they headed upstairs to tend to him. The rhythm of their lives was interrupted one afternoon when Daniel received a call from his lawyer. Mark had filed for partial custody of Adam, citing his biological connection as justification. The news hit Daniel like a blow, and as he hung up the phone, his hands shook with barely contained anger. Hannah found him in his study, pacing back and forth. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Mark," Daniel said bitterly. "He's filed for custody." Hannah's eyes widened in shock. "Custody? After everything he and Emily did?" Daniel nodded, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "He's trying to claim his rights as Adam's biological father." Hannah crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "That man abandoned his own child. He has no right to demand anything." "You're preaching to the choir," Daniel said. "But legally, he does. At least enough to fight me in court." Hannah stepped closer, her voice firm. "Then fight him. You've been Adam's father in every way that matters. No judge could look at what you've done and side with him." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I will. But the thought of having to put Adam through this, it makes my blood boil." Hannah placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You won't be fighting alone, Daniel. Adam has you. And he has me. We'll get through this." The court proceedings began a few weeks later, each hearing more emotionally draining than the last. Mark's lawyer painted him as a man desperate to make amends for his past mistakes, while Daniel's legal team emphasized the stability and love Adam had found in his care. Emily was called as a witness, her testimony a jarring mixture of remorse and self-preservation. She admitted to abandoning Adam during the storm but insisted she had been overwhelmed and confused. Her words, though emotional, were laced with the same selfishness that had defined her actions from the start. Throughout it all, Hannah remained by Daniel's side, her presence a constant source of strength. During one particularly grueling day in court, she leaned over to whisper, "No matter what they say, the truth is on your side." Daniel met her gaze, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I just want this to be over." The final day of the custody battle arrived, and the air in the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. Daniel sat at the table, his heart pounding as the judge began to read her decision. In reviewing the evidence and testimony provided, the judge said, her voice measured and deliberate, "It is clear that while Mr. Mark Graham is the biological father, his actions during the child's early life demonstrate a lack of responsibility and regard for the child's well-being." Daniel's breath caught, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Conversely, the judge continued, "Mr. Daniel Graham has shown consistent care, stability, and dedication to the child. Therefore, I rule in favor of Mr. Daniel Graham for full custody, with no visitation rights granted to Mr. Mark Graham at this time." Relief washed over Daniel like a tidal wave, and he exhaled deeply, his body finally relaxing after weeks of tension. Beside him, Hannah squeezed his hand, her smile radiant. "You did it," she whispered. "No," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." That evening, back at home, Daniel held Adam close, his heart swelling with gratitude. He looked at Hannah, who sat beside him on the couch, her eyes filled with the same relief and joy he felt. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Hannah smiled, reaching over to touch Adam's tiny hand. "We're a team, Daniel. And Adam, he's our little miracle." Daniel nodded, his resolve strengthening. Their fight for Adam wasn't just a legal victory, it was a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the bonds they had forged through adversity. Together, they had created a family, one built not on blood, but on trust, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to each other. Life after the court's decision began to settle into a peaceful rhythm. The relief of securing Adam's custody lifted a weight that had been pressing on Daniel for months. The shadows of the past, though still present, began to fade as their little family embraced the joy of the present. Adam grew stronger every day, his laughter filling the house with a warmth that neither Daniel nor Hannah had felt in a long time. Hannah had become an integral part of their lives. Her maternal instincts and gentle spirit were a balm not just for Adam but for Daniel, who found himself leaning on her more than he had ever expected. She had a way of seeing through his stoic exterior, offering support when he needed it most without ever making him feel weak. It was a dynamic that surprised him, a partnership built on mutual respect and unspoken understanding. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel stood at the kitchen window, watching as Hannah played with Adam in the yard. The trees were alive with vibrant reds and yellows, their leaves swirling in the breeze as Adam toddled unsteadily across the grass, his little hands reaching for Hannah's. She caught him just as he stumbled, scooping him up with a laugh that carried through the open window. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to simply watch, his heart full. It wasn't the life he had envisioned, but it was better in ways he couldn't put into words. Later that evening, as they sat by the fireplace with Adam snuggled between them, Daniel turned to Hannah. "I don't think I've said this enough, but I couldn't have done this without you." Hannah looked at him, her expression warm but teasing. "Oh, I know. You'd be buried under a mountain of dirty diapers and late-night feedings by now." Daniel chuckled, the sound genuine and light. "True. But it's more than that. You've been there for Adam. For me. In ways I didn't even know I needed." Her teasing expression softened. "You don't have to thank me, Daniel. Being here with you, with Adam, it's where I'm meant to be." As the days turned into weeks, Daniel began to think more about the future. He wanted to give Adam the kind of life filled with love, stability, and opportunity, a stark contrast to the rocky start he'd been given. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself considering what home truly meant. One afternoon, as they walked through the local park with Adam bundled in a stroller, Daniel broached the subject with Hannah. The park was vibrant with life, children laughing, leaves crunching underfoot, and the crisp scent of autumn in the air. "I've been thinking," Daniel began, his voice casual but laced with purpose, "about what comes next." Hannah glanced at him, curious. "Next? Like a new job or something?" "Not exactly," he said, pausing to adjust Adam's blanket. "I mean for us, for Adam." Hannah's brow furrowed slightly, but her tone was gentle. "What do you mean?" Daniel took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "This house, this life we're building, it feels right. Like we're a family. And I think it's time we made that official." Hannah stopped walking, her eyes widening. "Daniel." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "You've been more of a mother to Adam than anyone could have asked for. You've been there for him. For me. Through everything. I don't want you to feel like you're just helping us, I want you to be a part of us." Hannah's eyes filled with emotion, and she glanced down at Adam, who was happily playing with the edge of his blanket. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want us to be a family, not just in practice, but in name. I want you to be Adam's mom legally, and I want to figure out what this means for us, too." Hannah looked at him, her face a mixture of surprise and joy. "Daniel. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," he said, his tone lighter now. "Say you'll consider what it could mean for all of us." She smiled through the tears that threatened to spill. "I don't need to think about it. I already know what it means. It means everything." The weeks that followed were filled with preparations, both practical and emotional. Daniel filed the paperwork to legally recognize Hannah as Adam's mother, a process that required time but felt deeply rewarding. Their lives became a blend of routine and celebration, each step forward reinforcing the foundation of their growing family. On the day the papers were finalized, they invited a few close friends over to commemorate the occasion. The house, now filled with laughter and warmth, was a far cry from the lonely, sterile place it had been before Adam and Hannah entered Daniel's life. As they raised their glasses in a toast, Daniel looked around the room, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for: a family, a home, a future filled with hope. Later that night, as they stood by Adam's crib, watching him sleep, Daniel turned to Hannah. "I never thought I'd find this. Not after everything." Hannah smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes, life has a way of surprising us. And sometimes, it gives us exactly what we need, even if we don't see it at first." Daniel wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. For Adam. For us." And in that quiet moment, with their son sleeping peacefully and the future stretched out before them, Daniel knew they had finally found the life they were meant to build together. In the years that followed, Daniel, Hannah, and Adam created a life filled with love, laughter, and hope. The house that had once been a place of sorrow and loneliness became a home full of warmth and joy. Adam grew into a bright, adventurous child, his laughter echoing through the halls as a constant reminder of the power of second chances. Daniel and Hannah's bond deepened, their shared experiences transforming them into more than just partners. They became a family, bound by love and resilience. They faced life's challenges together, always holding on to the lessons they had learned about forgiveness, compassion, and the strength that comes from never giving up on those you love. As they watched Adam take his first steps into a world full of promise, Daniel and Hannah knew their journey had only just begun. Their story, born from tragedy, had become one of redemption and hope, a testament to the beauty of new beginnings. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales. Your support helps us continue sharing narratives that touch the heart and remind us of the strength of the human spirit. See you in the next story.